September 7th, 1943. Inside a German fighter control room, men stare at a radar scope and watch the same thing every controller both fears and wants to see. A big formation, American heavy bombers, hundreds of them, coming in during daylight like they own the sky. They're heading for the kind of target Germany can't afford to lose, industrial sites that keep the war machine running. And at this moment, the bombers don't have long-range fighter cover deep inside Germany. Not yet. So across airfields, the scramble orders hit. Ground crews sprint. Pilots climb into Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s. Engines cough, then roar. Wheels lift. And, in a twisted way, some of these pilots feel almost relieved. Because daylight is simple. You can see the enemy. You can intercept. You can fight. Now, real quick, if you like WWII stories that get into the gritty why behind the battles, hit subscribe and keep the bell on. You don't want to miss what's coming next. But here's the part that sounds crazy at first. Later that night, British bombers cross the coast under darkness, and those same German pilots suddenly find reasons not to fly. Weather, mechanical problems, crew fatigue, anything that sounds believable. By the end of the war, German airmen had a dark line that summed it up. The Americans? We can kill them. The British? They kill us. Not because British crews were superhuman, not because American crews were weak, but because the fights were totally different kinds of fear. And to understand why German pilots could feel confident against one bomber force and haunted by the other, you have to go back to the lessons everyone learned the hard way early in the war. In 1940, during the Battle of Britain, the Luftwaffe hammered targets by day and by night. And they learned expensive lessons about what bombers can and can't survive, what escorts matter, and how quickly air operations can burn through men and machines. So when strategic bombing turned into a full-time job on both sides, the Allies basically split the mission. The British leaned into night bombing. The Americans leaned into daylight precision bombing. Both approaches lost aircraft. Both got crews killed, but German fighter pilots expected, at least at first, that both could be beaten. In theory, German doctrine said, bombers are vulnerable. Find them, attack them, shoot them down, make the price too high. That confidence lasted, right up until German pilots ran into what RAF Bomber Command had turned into by 1942 and 1943, because the RAF didn't start the war as a smooth, efficient night bombing machine. Early on, the RAF tried daylight raids and took brutal losses. They learned the same lesson every Air Force learns when fighters control the sky. Unprotected bombers in daylight can get ripped apart. So the RAF adapted. They shifted toward night operations not just as hiding, but as a system. Darkness wasn't only cover anymore. It became a weapon. German pilots who fought at night didn't face a clean, obvious battle where you spot the enemy, line up, and fire. They faced a hunt that felt like chasing something that might not even be there, until it suddenly was. First problem, finding the bombers. At night, you're not patrolling a nice, clear battlefield. You're searching huge volumes of sky. Ground controllers try to guide you in, but radar isn't magic. It can be jammed, confused, or simply too messy to turn into an easy intercept. And the RAF worked hard to make it messy. British raids increasingly used electronic countermeasures, ways to interfere with German detection and guidance. They also learned how to route bomber streams in ways that complicated German defenses, shifting paths and timing so the intercept problem never stayed the same for long. But even when German night fighters got close, the danger didn't suddenly drop. It got worse, because now you're trying to approach a bomber you can barely see, and the bomber's rear gunner is watching for exactly one thing: the faint glow of your exhaust, the shape of you moving against the sky, the moment you commit. And when you commit, you're not behind the enemy, like a clean fighter duel in daylight. You're inside a deadly guessing game. The rear gunner might open fire before you even realize you're in his sights. Tracers at night work like a spotlight in reverse. They tell you where the gunner is, but they also tell him exactly where you are. Then came one RAF tactic the German night fighter pilots came to dread: the corkscrew. Think about what that means in the air. Not a gentle turn, not a slow descent. A violent diving spiral, down, then hard turn, then climb, designed to throw off the attacker's aim and force an overshoot. In darkness, with closing speeds and limited visual cues, that kind of maneuver turns a planned attack into chaos in seconds. If you're a night fighter pilot and you've finally gotten into position after climbing, searching, being vectored around the sky, managing fuel, managing nerves, then the bomber suddenly drops and twists like it fell off a cliff. Your choices are all bad. Follow and risk losing the bomber completely, hold position and watch it vanish, or commit too aggressively and overshoot, sometimes so close you risk collision in the dark. That collision risk is real. Night interceptions often happen with multiple bombers nearby, and depth perception at night is a liar. You can be sure you have space until you don't. Now stack that on top of the human side. Rear gunners were in the most isolated spot on the aircraft. They sat alone at the tail, freezing cold at altitude, staring into darkness for hours, knowing that if the bomber went down, their odds were terrible. And because the job was so deadly, the men who kept doing it successfully tended to be exactly the kind of people you don't want on your six: calm under pressure, trained to spot movement and light, and experienced enough to know the tricks. That created a brutal loop for the Germans. If a rear gunner was inexperienced, he might not survive many missions. If he survived many missions, he was probably good. And if he was good, he became a problem you couldn't ignore. So night fighting wasn't just harder, it was psychologically warped. In daylight, you fear the enemy because you see him. At night, you fear the enemy because you can't. German night fighter pilots described the exhaustion not as physical tiredness from flying, but as mental strain. The constant tension of searching, the sudden spikes of terror, and the feeling that at any moment you could flip from hunter to hunted without warning. And then the RAF made it worse by turning the entire night air defense system into a minefield of false signals. Instead of one clear raid you can chase, there could be decoys, small groups that show up on radar in ways that look bigger than they are, or routes that shift, or interference that makes the picture unreliable. So a night fighter crew might scramble, climb, patrol a designated sector, burn fuel, feel that tightness in the stomach the entire time, and never see a single bomber. Again, and again, and again. That kind of mission doesn't sound dramatic on paper. No gunfire, no kills, no losses, but it erodes you. Because you're still risking your aircraft. You're still flying in darkness. You're still on edge. And you come home empty, while bombs keep falling somewhere else. The German night war became a grind of uncertainty. Sometimes you'd find a target. Sometimes you'd get one pass. Sometimes you'd miss. Or the bomber would evade, or the whole stream would disappear into cloud and confusion. And every time, the British crews kept getting better at surviving that moment of contact. So by 1942 and into 1943, a lot of German pilots had reached a conclusion they didn't like saying out loud. The RAF at night wasn't just protected by darkness. The RAF had learned to use night to control the fight. And right when that realization set in, right when German night crews started feeling like the air itself was against them, the Americans came in with a completely different style of war. Daylight, big, tight formations, heavy bombers built around defensive firepower, and for German day fighter pilots, it looked like the war they'd trained for. A visible enemy, a clear intercept, and a chance to put skill and tactics to work. They believed they could solve that problem. They believed the Americans were bringing a target they could finally hit. But there was one detail hiding inside that confidence, one detail that would turn daylight is simple into daylight is a meat grinder. And it starts with what happens the moment a German fighter actually presses in close enough to kill a flying fortress. That's where we're going in part 2, to understand why daylight could feel easier and still be more deadly. You have to zoom in on the moment a German fighter pilot finally commits. Because the Americans didn't just show up in daylight. They showed up in daylight inside tight formations built around one brutal idea. If enough bombers fly close together, their guns overlap, and fighters get punished for every second they stay in range. The U.S. Army Air Forces brought heavy bombers like the B-17 and B-24 into the fight with a doctrine that sounded almost stubborn. Daylight precision bombing, flown in formation, defended by concentrated machine gun fire. To a lot of German pilots, especially after months of night frustration, it looked like a gift. No more hunting ghosts, No more empty patrol boxes. No more staring into black sky, waiting for a flicker of exhaust or a silhouette that might vanish before you even get a shot. In daylight, you could see the target from miles away. You could line up an intercept. You could actually fight. And early on, that confidence wasn't crazy. The Americans were still building their system. Long-range escort fighters weren't reliably with them deep over Germany yet. That meant German day fighters often got chances to attack the bombers without having to fight through escort screens first. So when big American formations approached, like those raids aimed at critical industrial targets, German controllers scrambled everything they could. And German pilots went up with a simple plan: get in, break the formation, knock bombers down fast. At first, the results looked like proof the Americans had made a huge mistake. Unescorted American raids that penetrated deep into German airspace sometimes took losses that were hard to ignore. Major missions could lose dozens of heavy bombers in a single day, loss rates high enough to make anyone wonder if the whole campaign could survive. To German pilots watching it happen, this was the war they expected. You attack, bombers fall, you count them. You see wreckage burning into the ground. That visibility matters. It's not just tactical. It's emotional. In daylight, the kills are real in a way night fighting rarely feels real. You can watch a bomber peel out of formation trailing smoke and flame. You can see parachutes or not see them. You can see the hole you just punched into the enemy's plan. At night, you often didn't even know if your shots hit. You might fire and lose sight instantly. A cloud. A turn. The bomber stream swallowing the scene. The fight was confusing. Daylight was clear, so German pilots leaned into tactics designed to exploit the American formation. One approach became especially famous because it attacked the bomber's weakest moment, the instant before all those guns could track you properly. Head-on attacks. Instead of sliding in from behind, where tail gunners are waiting and where multiple turrets can rake you, German fighters could come in from ahead, fast and steep. The closing speed was insane. You're not chasing the bomber, you're charging it. Done right, a head-on pass gave you a narrow window to fire into the nose and cockpit area before you flashed past and out of the heaviest defensive arcs. German units practiced it, refined it, and used it hard. In the early phase of the daylight bombing campaign, it helped them score heavily. From the German cockpit, it was almost a clean equation. The Americans hold formation. That makes them predictable. Predictable targets can be planned against. But that same equation had a second line that German pilots only fully understood after repeated fights. Predictable targets can also predict you, because to score a kill on a heavy bomber, you usually have to press close enough that your fire actually counts. That's where the American flying fortress idea turns from a nickname into a problem you can't talk your way out of. A B-17 wasn't a soft target. It carried multiple heavy machine guns placed to cover most approach angles, and the Americans designed their formations so that one bomber didn't fight alone. It fought as part of a box, where guns overlapped and attackers could be engaged by several aircraft at once. That changes the whole feel of an attack. A German fighter pilot isn't just thinking about the bomber he's aiming at, he's thinking about the bomber 2 positions over that also has a shot. And the one below, and the one behind, and the one that can't even see him yet, but will, in a second. In daylight, those gunners don't need imagination. They can see you. And when dozens of heavy guns start throwing tracer in your direction, it creates a wall of force that feels less like combat and more like pushing your plane through a storm made of metal. Here's the part a lot of people miss. Bomber defensive fire doesn't have to be perfect to be lethal. It doesn't have to be one amazing gunner making one impossible shot. It's math. If one aircraft shoots at you, you might slip through. If 5 aircraft shoot at you, your odds drop. If 10 aircraft shoot at you, and you have to stay in range long enough to ensure the kill, then even near misses become damage, and damage becomes a forced landing, and a forced landing becomes a dead pilot or a captured one. So German pilots faced a dilemma. To stop the raid, they had to attack. To kill bombers, they had to get close. To get close, they had to fly straight into concentrated defensive fire. And the worst part, if you were doing it right, you weren't just taking that risk once. You were taking it again and again, pass after pass, formation after formation, until you were out of fuel, out of ammo, out of nerve, or out of luck. This is where the Americans we can kill line becomes twisted. Yes, American bombers could be shot down. In some periods, German fighters knocked down a lot of them, but the act of killing them was grinding down German fighter strength at the same time. Every daylight intercept was guaranteed violence. At night, many sorties ended without contact. You might come back angry, frustrated, drained, yet alive, with your aircraft intact. In daylight, you didn't get that kind of empty mission. If the raid came, you fought. And if you fought, you took fire. That constant certainty, the certainty that you will be shot at right now by a formation that can fill the sky with defensive rounds, creates its own kind of fear. Not the fear of the unknown, the fear of the known. And German pilots started to talk about it in a way that sounds almost backwards. The British at night made you afraid you'd search for hours and still fail. The Americans by day made you afraid you'd succeed in finding them, because finding them meant you had to fly into that wall of guns. There's another layer that made the daylight battle even heavier: accountability. Night fighting was messy, claims were hard to confirm, contact was brief. Even honest pilots could be unsure what happened after they fired. Daylight interceptions were different. Too many eyes, too much film, too many witnesses from both sides. If you attacked and missed, people saw it. If you broke off early, people saw it. If you claimed a kill that didn't happen, somebody could challenge it. So the mental pressure wasn't only don't get hit, it was also don't fail in front of everyone. As the daylight campaign continued, German pilots noticed something else that scared them more than any single raid. The Americans kept coming. Losses that looked campaign-ending on paper didn't end the campaign. They slowed it. Then the next wave arrived, and the next. For the Germans, that created a terrible feeling. You're paying inexperienced pilots, the kind you can't replace quickly, and the enemy is paying in bombers and crews that, at least in the long run, seem replaceable at a bigger scale. So the trade could look favorable in one mission and still be fatal over months. This is the moment the daylight gift turned into dread, because German day fighter units were being pulled into a grinder where bravery was required, skill mattered, tactics helped, but none of it erased the math of cumulative risk. Press close enough often enough, and sooner or later, you get hit. That's why morale began to split along a strange line. Night fighting felt exhausting, uncertain, and deeply unpleasant, but survivable. Some nights you never found the bombers. Some nights you found them too late. Some nights the electronic interference and the shifting routes made the whole thing feel pointless. But you could come back without a shot fired. Day fighting felt straightforward and proper. Visible enemy, real dogfighting logic, clear results, but it demanded blood every time. And it wasn't optional. If you were a day fighter pilot and the scramble order came in daylight, you went. Not going wasn't a maybe. It was the kind of refusal that could get you treated like you were abandoning your post. So the daylight response stayed high. Units launched because they had to. At night, the system had more room for excuses. Weather truly mattered more. Mechanical issues were easier to claim. Crew fatigue was real. Night operations were punishing even without combat. And commanders often had to accept that not every aircraft would get airborne every time. Over time, those differences showed up in behavior. German pilots would brace themselves for the daylight intercept because it promised immediate, violent contact with a heavily armed enemy. And they would sometimes fade from the night intercept because it promised hours of searching, followed by a brief, dangerous moment that might not even happen, all while British bombs still hit German cities anyway. So the preference problem took shape. The British were hard to find. And the whole night war felt like chasing shadows that might kill you before you even understood what happened. The Americans were impossible to miss, but attacking them felt like stepping into a shooting gallery where the target shoots back harder than you do. By late 1943, German commanders and instructors could see the shift. Pilots were increasingly reluctant to attack American formations unless they had numbers, altitude advantage, or some tactical edge, anything to reduce the time spent inside that defensive fire. New pilots especially could be shaken by their first real pass. Seeing what concentrated bomber fire did to a fighter, how fast a plane could be shredded, made some of them hesitate on later runs. And hesitation in that role wasn't just fear, it was survival instinct. Because in daylight, There wasn't much space between 1 more second to aim and 1 more second and you're dead, so German pilots ended up trapped between two nightmares. At night, the terror of uncertainty. By day, the terror of certainty. And in the next phase of the story, that contrast becomes almost painfully clear, because in 1944, the daylight battles explode into something even bigger, and then the Americans bring a new element that makes the old preference irrelevant. That's where we go in Part 3. By 1944, the psychological split inside the Luftwaffe was no longer a rumor or a joke. It was a lived reality. Night fighter crews still dreaded the darkness, still dreaded the long climb, the endless searching, the sudden bursts of tracer that seemed to come out of nowhere. But many of them also knew something the day fighters didn't get anymore. Sometimes the night ended without combat. Sometimes you survived because you never found the enemy. Day fighter pilots didn't have that luxury. When the American formations came, daylight combat was almost guaranteed. The raid was visible, the intercept was direct, and if you were assigned to defend a sector, you were going up. By early 1944, German pilots had started to talk like men caught between two kinds of death. One slow and exhausting, one fast and violent. And on March 6, 1944, that difference was put on display in a way that was impossible to ignore. That day, the U.S. 8th Air Force launched a massive daylight raid toward Berlin, hundreds of bombers pushing deep, supported by escort fighters. German controllers scrambled day fighter units in huge numbers. The sky over Germany turned into a running battle that stretched across regions, not minutes. This wasn't a quick intercept. It was hours of continuous fighting, the kind of combat that drains pilots down to the bone, not just because of the flying, but because of the constant decisions: when to attack, when to break, when to dive away from gunfire, when to climb back up and do it again. In these big daylight battles, both sides could claim success and still feel wrecked by what it cost. Bombers went down, fighters went down, aircraft came back riddled with holes, others didn't come back at all. And when day fighter pilots returned from these raids, the physical signs were obvious: shaking hands, 1,000-yard stares, adrenaline crashes that left men nauseous beside their own aircraft. The difference wasn't that night pilots had it easy. It was that night pilots lived in uncertainty. Day pilots lived in certainty. 6 hours of daylight combat is not just 6 hours of flying. It's 6 hours of being hunted by guns, then hunting again, then being hunted again, over and over, until your brain stops feeling like it belongs to you. That same night, RAF Bomber Command could strike another German city with a huge force. German night fighters would scramble, climb, and spend hours trying to find a bomber stream that was slipping through darkness, clouds, countermeasures, and misdirection. Some crews might glimpse a bomber briefly silhouetted against fires below. Some might get a radar track that fades into noise. Many would land having fired no shots at all, and the results could look absurdly uneven. By day, a massive battle might knock down bombers but also cost Germany precious fighters and pilots, losses that were becoming harder to replace. By night, German fighters might spend the whole shift chasing shadows, while British bombs still fell and the number of bombers lost could stay relatively low. So German pilots reached a bleak conclusion. Neither fight was working the way they needed it to. Day fighting produced visible results but consumed them. Night fighting preserved them a little more, but often produced almost nothing. And then, the Americans added the factor that ended the argument entirely: long-range escort fighters. Early in the daylight campaign, German pilots could tell themselves, if we can just reach the bombers, we can do damage. Even if bomber guns were dangerous, at least the bomber was the main problem. But escort fighters changed the geometry of the sky. Now the Americans weren't just bringing bombers, they were bringing fighters with the range to stay with them deep into German airspace. Fighters that could meet interceptors before they ever reached the bomber boxes. That forced German pilots into a new, brutal choice: fight the escorts and let the bombers through, or try to push through the escorts to reach the bombers and take losses on the way in, then take bomber fire once you arrive. Either way, you were fighting on the Americans' terms. And that's what German pilots hated most: losing control of when, where, and how the fight happened. In the earlier phase, a German unit could sometimes time its attack. Choose an approach angle, use altitude as an advantage, hit the formation, then break off. With escort fighters roaming, that freedom shrank fast. The escorts could follow. They could stay above. They could come back for you after you broke away. They could turn your retreat into another fight. So the old preference became meaningless. You could no longer say, at least with the Americans, we understand the fight. Now you were being hunted in daylight by fighters while the bombers rolled on overhead. Even the idea of choosing your moment started to die. The Luftwaffe adapted the best it could. German pilots developed and refined tactics aimed at reducing exposure to bomber guns and at creating standoff options. They tried high-speed passes, diving through the formation to minimize time in the kill zone. They used weapons designed to strike from farther out, hoping to damage bombers without sitting inside the defensive fire envelope. They targeted stragglers, bombers that drifted out of formation, because a lone bomber is a very different problem than a bomber protected by a box. Some aircraft were fitted with heavier cannon that could destroy a heavy bomber with fewer hits, if you could get close enough to land those hits. But if you could get close enough stayed the same killer phrase as always. Close enough meant you were inside gun range. Inside gun range meant you were gambling with your life. And now, thanks to escorts, you might have already gambled once just to reach that point. Meanwhile, the RAF kept coming at night with a system built around survival and confusion. Darkness, electronic countermeasures, changing routes, decoy actions that pulled fighters toward empty sky, and tactics like the corkscrew that could turn a close pursuit into a sudden, violent escape. So German pilots found themselves facing two enemy air forces that attacked in opposite ways but produced the same end result. The British made the night feel like a haunted place where bombers could slip through and fighters could spend whole missions finding nothing. The Americans made the day feel like a factory for destruction, where every intercept meant flying into concentrated fire, first from escorts, then from bombers. At the emotional level, the old joke still held up, even if it wasn't literally true every night or every day. With the Americans, German pilots felt they could score kills. They could see the enemy. They could sometimes disrupt a raid. They could count results. But they also felt the cost rising with every pass. With the British, German pilots often couldn't even get a clean chance to fight. Success became less about winning and more about surviving the mission without being killed. And that makes a pilot feel like prey. That feeling, being prey, was what German pilots struggled to accept. A fighter pilot is trained to think of himself as the hunter. Day combat let them believe they were still hunters, even when it was deadly. Night combat increasingly made them feel hunted by an enemy that was hard to see, hard to intercept, and hard to predict. By late war, the combined pressure became the real story. The Allies didn't rely on one perfect method. They forced Germany to fight two air wars at the same time. A night war that demanded specialized aircraft, specialized crews, specialized radar, and training, yet often delivered limited results. And a day war that demanded the Luftwaffe commit its best pilots again and again into battles that bled experience out of the force. Germany needed both defenses, but it couldn't sustain both. That was the trap. Even when German fighters shot down American bombers at what looked like favorable exchange rates, the question wasn't, can we win today? The question was, can we keep doing this next month, next season, next year? Because the Luftwaffe didn't just lose aircraft, it lost veteran pilots, the hardest resource to replace. Training a fighter pilot takes time. Building his instincts takes combat. Losing him means losing a whole bundle of experience that you can't rush back into existence. And as the war dragged on, the quality gap widened. New pilots entered combat with fewer hours, less practice, and less confidence. Meanwhile, the Allied air forces built more aircraft, improved tactics, improved coordination, and kept tightening the noose. So when post-war analysts looked back at German air defense, they didn't find one single decisive moment where the Luftwaffe broke. They found a slow destruction caused by relentless pressure. By day, American raids forced combat at catastrophic cost. By night, British raids forced exhaustion, confusion, and constant strain. And together, those two approaches made German pilots dread the scramble order, no matter what time it came. Dawn could mean a wall of bombers and escorts. Midnight could mean hours of searching for something you might not find. knowing that failing to find it still means another city burns. This is why the fear split the way it did. Some pilots valued agency. They wanted a visible enemy. They wanted the chance to fight properly, even if it meant higher danger in the moment. Others valued survival. They could live with frustration and uncertainty if it meant fewer guaranteed firefights. Neither preference was wrong, but neither preference saved them, because the real winner wasn't day or night by itself. The real winner was the combination. One bomber force that was hard to intercept effectively in darkness. One bomber force that could be intercepted in daylight, but only at punishing cost. That combination didn't just damage factories and cities. It drained the Luftwaffe's strength, the Luftwaffe's experience, and eventually the Luftwaffe's ability to protect the airspace over its own homeland. So when you hear that old line, "The Americans we can kill, the British kill us," it's not a literal scoreboard. It's a description of how it felt. The Americans were visible, understandable, and deadly. The British were invisible, confusing, and terrifying in a different way. One made German pilots feel like hunters walking into gunfire. The other made them feel like hunters who had turned into prey. And in the end, both delivered the same outcome. German pilots climbed into the sky with less hope each month, facing enemies they either couldn't reliably find or couldn't safely attack, until the force that once dominated Europe was simply worn down, one mission at a time.